From courtside of the virtual hardwood, it's the NLSC Podcast, a weekly show for basketball gamers and hardcore hoopheads. This is episode 564. I am Andrew in our forum, Andrew NLSC on X. I'm joined as always by my co-host Derek, DP3 in the forum, and DP3G and DP384 on X. Derek, it's time once again to talk basketball and basketball gaming, so please tip us off.
Yeah, so first we will discuss a NBA 2K25 session using a Kobe era end of season roster, which, as our listeners know, the Kobe era in NBA 2K25 is based on the 02-03 season. Second, I asked the community to name the best all-time and in video games in these categories: dunking, shooting, blocks, steals, and going one-on-one. And lastly, we will end with another community question. What do you think most basketball video games get wrong when it comes to gameplay? But first, Andrew, we actually had a fun session on NBA 2K25 PC using a work-in-progress Kobe era roster. And my brother and I have been working hard on this. The base that we're using was uploaded by another basketball gamer. It's one of the most popular rosters on 2K Share, and basically what he did with this roster is he filled out all the teams with real players. So it's a great base to start with. But what my brother and I are doing in editing this roster is, one, making it an end of the season roster, because that's what we like to do. So the Bucks Supersonics trade where Ray Allen and Flip Murray were sent over to the Bucks for Gary Payton and Desmond Mason, etc. Like, that trade is reflected in this roster. But the other stuff that we're doing is we're editing signatures. If you notice, the Gilbert Arenas shot is basically right on. That's an edit that we made. So we're editing signatures, tendencies, attributes throughout the roster. And then we're going to re-upload it, obviously with credit to the original creator as well. So it will be an edited version, basically, heavily edited version of his roster. But I also had sliders that you actually saw me tweaking while we were connected. And these are based on the all-star difficulty and, adjusting things like body up, sensitivity, fatigue rate, fouls, stuff like that. And I think you would agree that that was probably the best session that we've had on that game, and probably the best the game has felt.
It has, and it shows that editing those rosters, fixing those tendencies, and of course adjusting sliders is so important. And look, we've said it before, we stand by it. It is important that games impress out of the box. The rosters really should be better, the tuning should be better, but we are a modding community, Derek. We can make these edits to rosters. We can tinker with the games. We know how they work. We want to improve them for ourselves and our fellow gamers. So it is vital that we do this. And yes, it would be better if the games were better out of the box, so to speak. That's digital release, so no boxes these days. Outdated terminology, just like the floppy disk as a save icon, Derek. But yeah, fantastic job with the rosters so far. Even work in progress, I can tell it's going to be fantastic. So shout out to you and your brother. Shout out to the original creator for putting in that work as well. And yeah, it is great that the community is doing this.
Yeah, it's actually been a lot of fun, and we're really trying to get the most out of NBA 2K25. In this game that Andrew and I played, we controlled the Warriors versus the CPU Supersonics. That's the new look Supersonics, like I stated, with Ray Allen and Flip Murray, and they still have Rashard Lewis, so they're a fun video game team, and they were definitely a big challenge for us in this game. We ended up losing this one in a close battle. Those highlights are up on the NLSC YouTube. But just to give people an idea of why I chose the Warriors, Andrew, they're just a fun video game team, and they actually got more fun when I put together the end of the season roster, because they acquired Earl Boykins, who finished the season with them, and he's usually fun to use in video games. But they did not finish this season super strong. They went 38-44. The Supersonics went 40-42, so they weren't that much better. But this Warriors team is just a fun video game team. They have Gilbert Arenas, Jason Richardson, Anton Jameson, Troy Murphy coming off the bench. They have Bob Sura, who we both love, right? and shoot the ball. He can slash, do a bunch of different things. He's a fun player, played with attitude, etc. And that was why I chose them. We were the underdog in that one, and they have a lot of fun players to use. And for the Supersonics, like people were talking about, pretty weird trade. And I think that there was a feud going on between Ray Allen and George Karl at the time, who was the coach of the Supersonics. And the organization actually sided with George Karl in that feud, which ended up having them ship Ray Allen out. And what's weird is they didn't get much back. They got Gary Payton, who was kind of long in the tooth at that point, right? He only had a few years left in his NBA career. And they got Desmond Mason, who was an outstanding dunker, one of my favorite dunkers of all time, had an amazing dunk contest. Remember, he went under the leg, that famous gif that people use on social media sometimes. But some of his dunks, my brother and I were watching some of the top 10 countdowns from the early mid-2000s. And some of his dunks, Andrew, his head was above the rim.
Oh, yeah.
His elbow was at
athlete,
the rim.
Yeah. And it's funny because Gary Payton was also involved in a feud with ownership as well. And that's what resulted in him being shipped to Milwaukee. And it was kind of petty because Payton ended up playing 999 games for the Supersonics. They traded him just before he played his 1,000th game for the team. But there had been a feud brewing there since the previous year, so the writing was on the wall. 2 players traded basically because management sided with the coach.
Silly stuff. And that set the Bucks back quite a bit. They had a struggle for the next decade and whatnot to be relevant in the Eastern Conference. And I also want to point out, though, that because of that trade, the Bucks actually are possibly even more fun in video games. So now after the trade, they have Gary Payton, they still have Sam Cassell, they had Desmond Mason, they had Anthony Mason, Tim Thomas, Michael Redd, who I believe averaged 18 to 19 points a game or something like that in that season. He was good at that point. They had Dan Gadzarich. They had Tony Kukoc. They are a really fun video game team. And they actually did make the playoffs that year, and they got bounced out of the first round by the Nets, who made the finals that year again, and they ended up getting taken out by Duncan's Spurs. I also want to point out a fun fact, which I also pointed out on social media. So Ray Allen got traded on February 20th, 2003. The next day, February 21st, 2003, the Bucks played the Supersonics, but he was inactive. And it's funny, the Supersonics won that game by 30. Guess how many points the Bucks scored in that game? 58. Early 2000s basketball.
Yeah.
It happens sometimes, right? Especially when teams had inactive players and whatnot. Just the hand checking was still allowed at that point. The game was super physical, all of that stuff. So you would see those low scores. But yeah, I'm getting into editing that Kobe era roster. It's actually been a lot of fun. My brothers and I are really trying to get the most out of NBA 2K25. And if I look at Steam right now, we have put 294 hours into the game. So yeah, I would say we got our money's worth.
Yeah, and look, we did our final review of NBA 2K25 a couple of shows ago, but we're not done with the game. As I said, I've put it aside, but seeing these rosters out there playing with you, yeah, I do want to play some more. Before we go on, a reminder that the NLSC podcast comes out every week on the NLSC, nba-live.com, as well as our YouTube channel. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. If you're listening on any of those apps, we'd greatly appreciate a review. To keep up with the show and everything we're doing with basketball gaming in general, connect with us on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, we are the NLSC. We also have an Instagram, NLSC Basketball, and on YouTube, we're youtube.com/NBA Live Series Center. Once again, visit us at nba-live.com, where in addition to the podcast, you'll also find all of our original content, as well as our forum and modding community.
So let's get to the first community question, Andrew. I asked Hoopheads, name your best of the best all time in these categories. First for real life, followed by in video games. Dunking, shooting, blocks, steals, and going one-on-one, so ISO. So, Andrew, let's start off. In real life, best of the best dunker of all time.
You know, my heart really wants to say MJ, and I think he is absolutely a candidate, but I am actually going to say Vince Carter for this. I mean, just tremendous dunks in-game, in the contest. Even into his 40s, he was able to very casually throw down between the legs dunks. We saw that in the warm-ups. So I'm actually going to go with Vince.
Not a bad choice. Nobody's going to argue with you. I think he is probably the most popular choice as greatest dunker of all time. I'm actually going with Jordan.
Fair enough.
And
I won't disagree either.
It was very tough. I think that Jordan had more dunks on contact. There's no stat that I can find for that, but I felt like Jordan dunked on contact more often. I feel like Jordan was an overall better in-game dunker than Vince. I love the speed in which Jordan attacked the rim when he threw it down. But yeah, it's really tough for me because it's hard for me to even put Vince Carter above Dominique Wilkins as an in-game dunker. You know, Dominique Wilkins, probably the non-center who dunked with the most aggression, with the most power. Some of his two-handed slams, I thought he was going to rip the basket down. Right. He also dunked with style, and he would dunk on anybody and challenge anybody. You know, there's a couple other guys, you know, that are honorable mentions here as well, as Daryl Dawkins, Shaq. Shaq didn't dunk with a lot of style, right? Because he didn't have that coordination and flexibility and whatnot. He didn't get as high, obviously, off the ground as people like, you know, Vince and Neek and Jordan and whatnot. But Shaq's got to be right up there in the conversation of greatest dunkers, because he would just overpower you and embarrass you and dunk it so hard. It was ridiculous. Sean Kemp is another favorite for a lot of people. He's an honorable mention as well. So, but for me, greatest dunker all time, especially in game, is Michael Jordan, and then those honorable mentions.
For sure, and all these years later, we still enjoy watching their greatest highlight reels. And Shaq, like you say, doesn't have the flair of the other players, but who didn't love watching a Shaq attack? Just that raw power, the backboard sagging, a couple of times coming down, obviously, and you're always hoping that it was going to come down again.
Yeah, I think you look at the dominance of a guy like Wilt Chamberlain and Shaq, and you look at it a little differently, right?
Sure.
Chamberlain was more of a finesse player around the hoop, at least with all the highlights that I watched. It was also a different time in the NBA and in basketball in general. But Shaq was going to try to throw it down on you on every possession if possible. So I think that Wilt had a nicer touch. Wilt had that post fadeaway. Wilt could do more with the ball as a scorer than Shaq, but Shaq was definitely more commonly going up for big dunks and trying to throw it down on you. So in video games, Andrew, best of the best, greatest dunker that you've experienced.
I'm actually going to say MJ for this one, especially when they started to include his full dunk package in the games that came along in the 2010s with NBA 2K11. Obviously, the fact that I'm always equipping Michael Jordan's dunk package for my player when it's available, I think speaks volumes. I want to dunk like MJ. I want to be like Mike, you know, to go back to last week's show. But I'll also give an honorable mention to Shaq, specifically in NBA Live 2002, because you got near the rim with Shaq in 2002. Nobody was stopping him.
Yeah, for me, it's a tie between Shaq and MJ. I think that with Shaq, too, since the drop step has been so dominant in 2K games for almost a decade now, Shaq is just unstoppable with that move, right?
Yeah.
If you drop step with Shaq, it's basically a dunk almost every single time. I think that they really got it right with MJ, especially in games like NBA 2K11, where he had the full animation package, and just you started to go downhill with MJ, and it was, you know, you were expecting an awesome dunk, and you would usually get one. Right, exactly. And then they had the free throw line animation that would play out, and that was excellent as well. Honorable mention to guys like Josh Smith in both NBA Live and NBA 2K games. Oftentimes they didn't make him quick enough in those games, but once you did start going downhill, you could put up some monster slams with Josh Smith. There's obviously other good in-game dunkers. We just mentioned Desmond Mason, and he was pretty good in some video games throwing it down. Alonzo G in NBA 2K13 was absolutely ridiculous. We would get killed by him, by my brother Nick. Spin dunks, dunks in traffic. He was like a souped-up Julius Erving in NBA 2K13. Screw Alonzo G, honestly, Andrew. We still have nightmares about him. But yeah, there's a lot of guys in past video games that were not known for being huge dunkers in real life, but damn, they could do it in the video game. One of them is Mikhail Petrus, right? The French Jordan, as we would call him,
yes.
In the house. And in some of the old NBA Live games, and I believe a couple mid-2000s NBA 2K games, you get Petrus going downhill around the fast break, and he is throwing down a loud one. In fact, I want to say that I was playing NBA 2K9 even, and I shared a highlight reel of this where I was throwing it down constantly with Mikhail Petrus. So yeah, it's always fun the guys that were not known for being huge dunkers in real life. You use them in a video game and they are just unstoppable going to the hoop.
And you mentioned the drop step, obviously, for Shaq, and that reminded me of playing 2K6, which, as you know, has become a retroactive favourite for me, and just backing down in the post with Shaq, with the triggers, using the shot stick to just do that drop step and go up and dunk really hard. That is really satisfying in that game.
Oh yeah, totally. And obviously when I asked this question, I wasn't really going for arcade games, right? I'm going for more 5-on-5 sim, because if we went with arcade games,
That's
and
cheating.
I would obviously be yeah, it's kind of cheating. I mean, we would probably go with Sean Kemp on NBA Jam OFE.
Yep.
But yeah, no arcade games included here. So let's get to shooting. So I'll start on this one. So in real life, I have this broken up. Curry for threes, Jordan in the mid-range, and Larry Bird all around. And the reason why I say that is if you can't say that Steph Curry, in my opinion, you can't say that Steph Curry is the greatest shooter of all time. You can say he's the greatest three-point shooter, but shooting doesn't just take place behind the three-point line. In fact, at one point, Andrew, there was no three-point line.
That's right.
Right? So if you asked Curry to score 30 points a game the way that Jordan did and do the things that Jordan did in the mid-range, he couldn't, right? He would absolutely have no chance to do that. In fact, I think that if you asked Jordan to shoot more threes like Curry, he would be better off that way than trying to have Curry play like Jordan, right? In the mid-range. So Jordan is the greatest mid-range shooter of all time. Curry, the greatest three-point shooter. And I would say Larry Bird might be the most all-around shooter, because he could shoot over 40% from three, right? Couldn't leave him open out there. Hit guarded shots, hit clutch shots from behind the three-point line. You post him up, he turns over his left or right shoulder and can just smoke shots over you, high arcing shots, splashing through the net. Great mid-range shooter. So post shooting, mid-range shooting, three-point shooting. Larry Bird is my choice probably for all-around.
Oh, I absolutely agree, and I'm going to have to copy your answer, actually, and say Larry Bird as the best all-around shooter. Like you say, it isn't just about outside the arc, it's also inside the arc as well. Just being able to shoot from anywhere, being able to make all kinds of shots. Just deciding to shoot left-handed because you're bored in the middle of a road trip. Look, it sounds weird whenever you say one of the all-time greats who's in the Hall of Fame is underrated, but when you talk about people putting down the past, players like Larry Bird really get underrated.
Yeah, especially Larry, because people watch his highlights and he's not jumping out of the gym like MJ, right? He's not moving the same way as a Kobe, but they forget to think about the fact that some of the most dominant players in the NBA today are not the best athletes
Doncic?
in the NBA today, and Jokic and Doncic and SGA even. Right? Like, he's kind of a methodical player. He's not, elevating above the rim and whatnot. He's smart at getting to his spots. And oftentimes he's kind of slow or average getting to his spots, but he's a smart player. Right? So, like, yeah, I think a lot of the kids today just jump on the bandwagon of, crapping on certain past players in order to, prop up today's product and also just to be part of the conversation.
Definitely.
And it does definitely get old. In video games, for shooting, Andrew, I'm just going to say Ray Allen. There's a reason why I put us against Ray Allen in that game, because it feels weird using Ray Allen. He's a villain. And I have just been torched countless times by Ray Allen, whether it's a human user or a CPU, etc., just getting absolutely killed for decades by him. I also want to point out there's definitely an honorable mention there. I would say Kyle Korver. But Ray Allen is the best shooter I've ever faced in video games.
Ray Allen is definitely up there for me as well. Steph Curry, obviously very effective to bomb away with, especially in games from the last 10 years or so. And you know what? I'll also give Bird an honorable mention because he can shoot the lights out in video games as well. Sometimes his jump shot may be difficult to handle, depending on how well it's done. I'm actually going to say Reggie Miller, historically, because fantastic ratings and his height as well, being able to shoot over other players. Reggie's just been a gun going back to the 90s.
And Dan Marley in NBA Live 95, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Torched.
After what I did to you there that you still have nightmares about.
3.
All right, let's move on to blocks. So who do you have in real life for the best shot blocker of all time?
This was kind of a tough one because there's been some really standout shot blockers over the years, but I am going to go with Mark Eaton. I know that's kind of an easy choice with him being the all-time leader in blocks per game, the highest average of all time, I should say, and a multi-time block champion over the years during his career. And of course, people say, oh, well, he was 7'4". Of course, he blocked a lot of shots. But as you know, Derek, there's been a lot of really tall players over the years who haven't been tremendous shot blockers, haven't had the reach, haven't had the length, haven't had the defensive instincts, the coordination, etc. Mark Eaton, when you can just block shots standing there, blocking Rex Chapman at the rim, just standing there and pinning it against the backboard, I have to pick him as my all-time best shot blocker.
So this one was really tough for me. Mark Eaton is actually an honorable mention for me. And the reason is because he had 456 blocks in a single season in 84-85. Nobody has even gotten close to that. Nobody else has ever had over 400 blocks in a single season since they started recording them in 73, 74. That's 5.6 blocks per game. You know what's another unbelievable fact about that, Andrew? It was in 82 games. He played all 82 games, started all 82 games, 34.3 minutes per game. That is outstanding work by Mark Eaton. He also averaged 11.3 rebounds per game that season. The reason why he's an honorable mention. So Wilt Chamberlain, somebody went back and they watched as many games as they possibly could. I think there was around 100 games. And or took snippets from newspapers, which reported how many blocks he had, even though they weren't tracked, people were counting them and whatnot. And I believe out of the 100 games that they watched and or took from like newspaper clips and whatnot, he averaged about 10 blocks a game.
Yeah.
And I think Russell was around 8.7 or 9 blocks per game. And you watch the footage, and whether it was young or old Wilt Chamberlain, he just had impeccable timing, just great timing, great coming over from the weak side, challenging, people coming to the hoop and whatnot. And most of the time he could just really get up. There's footage of one block where he blocks it almost near the top of the backboard, right? I think that Mark Eaton was not close to as mobile as Wilt Chamberlain, whether it was young or aging Wilt Chamberlain. And I feel like if Wilt Chamberlain was playing in the era of Mark Eaton in the 80s and whatnot, I feel like he would have even had more blocks than Eaton based on the footage, based on those numbers that I just mentioned. So I'm going with Wilt Chamberlain first, Bill Russell second, Mark Eaton third, and Akeem Olajuwon fourth. And Akeem Olajuwon did have almost 400 blocks in one season. It was over 370. Akeem was more mobile than Eaton, and more of an all-around defender. He even had 213 steals in a single season, which would basically lead the league today and whatnot. But Akeem's mobility, the way he could rim protect, all of that, he's definitely right there in that conversation.
Oh, I absolutely see the reasoning. And it is hard to go past Wilt or Russell when you go back and look at the footage, when you consider what the stats would have been. And as you say, people have worked it out what the averages probably would have been. One thing I will say about Wilt, he did care a little bit too much about that record he had where he hadn't fouled out in a game ever. And his contemporaries noted that if he was getting close to fouling out, he might as well have been Muggsy Bogues for as much as he was challenging shots at the rim because he didn't want to foul out, wanted to preserve that record. And people have talked about Wilt, as great as he was, caring too much about image, not wanting to appear to be to blame for the loss, didn't want to take those clutch free throws, knew he was going to miss them. That's why Havlicek made his great steal. He knew the ball wasn't going to Wilt in those last seconds. That's why he was able to anticipate where that was going to go. So when we talk about Wilt, I always think about that he might have been great for 45 minutes. Of course, he was playing 48 minutes, 48.5 minutes one season, more than a regulation game. That if his reputation or a record was on the line, he wouldn't necessarily play as hard, and Sam Jones has talked about taking advantage of that as well. But yeah, swatting shots like playing volleyball, and of course he was a tremendous volleyball player as well. But yeah, the numbers would have been astronomical, and of course he could have even played in the 80s. There was talk of him making a comeback.
Yeah, even with that, he would have probably beat Eaton on blocks, in my opinion. I'd take that mobility, True. Right? And I think that he was just that much better of an athlete than Eaton. I also want to point out that I'd have to see some of that footage, and I've seen the footage of him getting swats, right? I've seen him coming over from the weak side. I've seen just some incredible stuff from him from a defensive standpoint. Obviously, he cared about his numbers more than the average player. Obviously cared about his image in that regard, the record books, all of that stuff. But I'd have to see footage of him not going for it, right? Yeah. I'd have to see footage of somebody, crashing the lane, driving the lane, or somebody on the fast break where he could, be in position to block a shot and then just him not do anything. So I still take Chamberlain and Russell over Eaton. But like I said, Eaton's a great honorable mention, as is Akeem.
And obviously, all of those players swat shots on the virtual hardwood as well. Great to block shots with in video games. But my pick there is actually going to be Sean Bradley. Again, simply because of the height advantage you have in games and how he already had the high ratings, was able to block a lot of shots anyway. But having that larger model in games also gave him that natural advantage, as it did in real life. And I also want to say that Sean Bradley is one of the best shot blockers in history. Again, people might say 7'6", of course he's going to be, but not every tall player had huge blocking numbers. He had those defensive instincts. He wasn't the greatest athlete, was able to use his size effectively, and didn't get a lot of fouls, considering he was going for so many blocks.
Yeah, I mean, he had many seasons with over 200 blocks. And for his career, he averaged 2.5, but he averaged 4 blocks a game one season, 3.4, 3.7, 3.6, etc. Excellent shot blocker, stronger than he was given credit for, good rim protector. I'm going to say anybody 7'6" or 7'7" in video games are the greatest shot blockers of all time in video games, or any big men in NBA Live 2004. Just those canned blocks in that game just come so often and come so fast, and just the big guys are so dominant protecting the rim in that game. I'm just going to go with most big men in NBA Live 2004 are the greatest shot blockers in video game history.
No, that's a good call. Absolutely. But if we want to talk about the best block, singular block in video game history, might have been in the top 10 this past week.
Yeah, that was excellent by Teddy Bear the Gamer on NBA 2K25. Very rare to get a block that ricochets off the rim. And those highlights never get old. I love those unique highlights in the top 10. So for steals, Andrew, real life, I have a cross between Michael Jordan and John Stockton. Despite Alvin Robertson getting the single season steal record of 301. I also have to give an honorable mention to Jerry West, who had, I believe, 81 steals, roughly around there, in 31 games in his final NBA season, in the only season that he played where they actually recorded that stat. I'm sure he would have put up monster steal numbers, and past players have talked about how good of a defender he was and how quick his hands were and whatnot. But just Michael Jordan, the size of his hands, which has been noted many times by former players, media, former coaches, etc. Just his ability, his quickness in the passing lanes, how quick he could react in real time. And then just Stockton, the all-time steals leader. Just Jordan and Stockton were both so consistent stealing the ball on defense, ball hawks, etc. So I have Jordan and Stockton as a tie.
No, that definitely makes sense, and it's hard to argue, obviously. And I did think about both of them, and probably putting them as a tie is the best answer. I did actually go with Alvin Robertson, simply because he does have the all-time record for the average in a single season and his career. Just an excellent thief on the court. But, yeah, just some of the best pickpockets in NBA history there.
Yeah, I think there's something needs to be said for consistency.
True.
Right? And he was excellent. I mean, he averaged 2.7 steals per game for his career, which I believe is actually the all-time best. So you can't argue with that, right? I think I'm bringing overall defender into this as a ball hawk and whatnot, and maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should state Alvin Robertson is the greatest at steals of all time. But Jordan and Stockton, for me, just stand out.
Oh, for sure. And this is touching on another topic that we might have to circle back to, but players like Alvin Robertson, Xavier McDaniel is another one. I think of them as 80s players because that was when they were at their peak, when they had their most success. But they played into the 90s almost as long as players like MJ and other players that came along at the same time, they're contemporaries, and yet I don't think of them as 90s players. Kind of weird.
Yeah, Alvin Robertson played so long that he actually ended up playing for the Toronto Raptors.
Yeah.
Right? So the memorable season where he was bald and playing for Toronto. And in that season, he was actually, and this is what's crazy too, because you think of these guys as old, right? He was only 33.
Yeah, MJ's age. He's his contemporary, yeah.
Yeah. In 95, 96, he actually played 77 games, started 69 of those games, obviously put up good steal numbers again. He averaged 2.2. He averaged 9.3 points, 4.4 rebounds, 4.2 assists, 47% from the field. Solid season for him. But yeah, you think of these guys sometimes as like bald and old or, way out of their prime, but 33 is not old, right? Whether it was back then or today. So interesting stuff right there. So in video games for steals, I'm just going with Michael Jordan in NBA 2K19 because I'm so sick of him with my brother using him and just getting 10 plus steals per game. He's so fast. He's constantly knocking the ball away, etc. In 2K19, Jordan, he's the best at steals I have ever seen. Historically in video games, it's tough because it depends on the video game. And I think that a lot of the smaller guards have a pretty big advantage. Whether you're playing, older games with Stockton or you're playing newer games with even guys like Russell Westbrook and whatnot, they're more low to the ground. They can often poke the ball away easier or rub up against the ball easier, etc. So it's tough for me to pick, one player historically overall, but I'm going with Jordan in NBA 2K19 for steals.
Makes sense. Absolutely. And I'm going to give an honorable mention to my NBA 2K14 My Player, simply because when you upgrade the steals, the pickpocket signature skill, it just becomes an absolute cheat code. But as far as real players and reflecting their actual skill, I absolutely love your picks, obviously, but I'm going to say Scottie Pippen, simply for all the steals I made back in NBA Live 95, and him being a tremendous pickpocket in real life as well. But yeah, over the years, Pippen, I've always been able to get a lot of steals with him.
Yeah, and he's super versatile in video games too, usually.
Yep.
Just, he can guard so many different positions. Sometimes in certain video games, you can put him at like center, and he can hold his own and whatnot. So, yeah, Pippen's usually very good to use in most video games. So going one-on-one, Andrew, iso ball. Who do you choose best of the best all time in real life?
Has to be Michael Jordan. Look at all the moves. Look at how they had to throw double teams at him, because if you let him go one-on-one, what a disaster it would be for the defense. Just his array of moves, everything that he could do, the strength, the athleticism, the coordination, the shooting touch. Yeah, what a nightmare to guard one-on-one.
Yeah, that's too easy for me. Jordan, MJ. It's just the plethora of moves, the smoothness of his game, his strength, right, which Kendall Gill talked about. He actually said that Jordan was a lot stronger than Kobe, and he played against both of them and whatnot. I think that just the combination of everything that Jordan could do athletically, skill-wise, just the array of moves, different ways he could attack, definitely choose Jordan. Also, the players that are toughest to guard, in my opinion, in real life, and when I play, and then obviously in like the NBA and whatnot historically, are the players who make the quick decisions, right? Who can catch and go, or they can get you on one quick move and whatnot. Jordan never really over dribbled. He would attack you, and you always had to be on your toes when guarding him. So yeah, I choose MJ. So what about in video games?
Well, I also said MJ for games, but as a tie with Kobe, because how fun is Kobe to play with in video games, to go one-on-one with? He is tremendous in real life as well. I do rank MJ as being a little bit better. Sometimes Kobe would be a bit predictable, and there were a couple of times when teams put a tall, lanky defender on him. Kevin Durant, Tayshaun Prince, very infamously in the 2004 NBA Finals, just really seemed to bother Kobe. So I do rank MJ ahead of him. That being said, Kobe is right up there. But in video games, yeah, a lot of fun and very effective.
Yeah, for me, in video games, best one-on-one all time is Kobe. And the reason is because the video games just can't get it right a lot of the time with Michael Jordan as far as doing the quick moves, right? Catching the ball and going, or making that one hesitation dribble and then bursting and getting by the defense. Kobe is usually better to use, in my experience in video games, because they made him a better ball handler than MJ, and because that's the way to go one-on-one in so many video games, is to break somebody down with a set of moves and then a crossover, right? A set of moves into a spin move, etc. So solely because the way games are historically created, most basketball video games where you can't use MJ like you can, like he played in real life, Kobe gets the nod on my end.
And of course, there's been a lot of games where MJ should have been in the game, but was absent or not included as a legend. So Kobe was the closest you had.
Exactly. So let's get to the community responses. We did have a few. T. Gentry at Bucky T states, dunking, MJ, shooting, Ray Allen, blocks, KG, steals, Stockton, and CP3. And he says it's a tie, and one-on-one ISO, Kobe. So I'm guessing he's saying in real life. Those are his choices because he only gave one choice for each. And those are some good choices there.
Yeah, and of course, pretty effective on the virtual hardwood as well. And coming back to Ray Allen for shooting, I did actually use his jump shot style in one of my My Career games. I forget which one. It was pretty effective, but I kind of alternated between him, Klay Thompson, and Steph Curry, depending on which one worked best online.
Yeah. See, I don't enter that scene, but if I was in the online scene, I would do whatever I could just to get a shot that was the easiest to use, because there's a lot of broken shots out there.
Oh, yeah. That's what
right?
you have to do. Yeah.
Or shots that are super hard to time. So I know that Klay Thompson is definitely one of the best releases over the last few years, at least with my experience playing the games offline. So that would make sense. Klay Thompson's base and his release. So Chuck LA at Chuck LA 92 states, in real life, dunking, Vince Carter. In video games, MJ. Shooting, in real life, Curry. And in video games, Ray Allen. Blocks, in real life, Mutombo. In video games, David Robinson. Steals, in real life, Stockton. In video games, Pippen. So there's a nod there to one of your choices, right? Or your honorable mentions. And then ISO, MJ in real life, and MJ in video games. Some solid and similar names that we mentioned. But yeah, he mentions Ray Allen in video games. And I wonder if Bucky T was also alluding to video games as well when he said shooting Ray Allen.
Definitely. And love seeing the love shown to David Robinson, such a tremendous athlete, such a skilled player. People focus on Hakeem, making him look silly on that one play. Hakeem made a lot of plays look silly with his tremendous footwork, obviously. But David Robinson kind of maligned sometimes because the Spurs not getting over the hump until Tim Duncan came along. You can only do so much as the lone star on the team. No pun intended with him playing in Texas, of course. Sean Elliott, fine player. Tim Duncan, so much better. But yeah, David Robinson, what a player.
So let's move over to the Discord, Andrew. Pep states in real life, dunking Vince Carter, shooting Steph Curry, blocks, another vote for Dikembe Mutombo, steals Chris Paul, and ISO Michael Jordan. And then he says, in video games, Mike Conley in all categories. So I never thought Mike Conley was that dominant in video games. So I'd have to ask some additional questions to Pep to kind of get an idea of what he's talking about. But yeah, Mike Conley in all categories, obviously joking, but still kind of funny.
But that's how it goes sometimes. You know, we talk about virtual hardwood legends being those players who aren't fantastic in real life or aren't stars in real life who can be superstars on the virtual hardwood. But at the same time, you've also got players who are pretty good who are even more amazing in games. And whether you call them virtual hardwood legends or some other category, maybe Mike Conley falls into that for him.
Yeah. I mean, Dan Dickau had some incredible performances, I want to say, in like NBA Live 2004 and NBA Live 2005. And for that specific game, I might put him in first in all categories. So I see where he's coming from. Juicy Shack Meat states that in real life and in video games for dunking, Vince Carter, for shooting in real life, Steph Curry, and in video games, Michael Jordan, blocks, Dikembe Mutombo in real life, Wembanyama in video games, steals, John Stockton in real life, Michael Jordan in video games, and ISO in real life and in video games, Michael Jordan.
Yeah, obviously we have some pretty similar opinions on real basketball to our listeners and members of the community, and also some very common experiences on the virtual hardwood. Wemby, again, that tall player, just spot everything in video games. And Steph Curry, yeah, I get the pick because he does have a tremendous shooting touch.
Yeah, totally. And, about tall players, whether it was George Mirasan, whether it was Sean Bradley, Hasheem Thabit, now Wemby, Manute Bol in past games, Yao Ming, anybody that's 7'3" or 7'4" and taller was just an absolute menace. And the funny thing is they weren't just a menace on defense. Even if they were, not known for scoring in real life, guys like Manute Bol, etc., you could just oftentimes dominate in video games with them because they were so tall. You get them the ball right under the hoop and they could just go right up and score. So thank you for all the community responses related to that question. Let's end the show on yet another community question, Andrew. I stated, basketball gamers, what do most basketball video games get wrong when it comes to gameplay? And I'm going to give my response first real quick. So I couldn't just choose one area. And it's because most games get all of these things wrong, or at least a couple of them. So shooting contested. So like taking contested shots and being able to make them. Most games don't get it right as it relates to real life basketball. Oftentimes in video games, you definitely need a lot more space than you would in real life to make shots with good shooters. Right. The next thing is on-ball defense. I think that whether it's too much brick wall defense like NBA 2K17, or it's too much blow by like NBA 2K18, it's really hard for most basketball video games to produce a realistic result when it comes to on-ball defense. The best happy medium that I've probably seen in a video game might be NBA 2K16. That might be the most realistic representation of on-ball defense. And then lastly, I would state foot planning. I think that there's a lot of games historically, and then obviously with the recent 2Ks, especially since 2K18, there's been a lot of games where there's just a lot of sliding and a lot of skating and players are kind of floating above the court. I think that that's been an ongoing problem for a long time with a lot of different basketball video games. And unfortunately, that impacts the feel of games in a big way. And then I have an honorable mention here, and I mentioned this on the last show, making a player play like their real life counterpart. Games struggle with that because they lock them into like playing a position. So basically, like you have a guy in video games who's a good example. Amare Stoudemire, I brought him up. So in video games, oftentimes he is a slug. You can't make any moves with him because they're locking him into like being a power forward or center, right? They're like they're basically stating because he's a power forward or center, he's not going to be quick. He's not going to get up the floor fast. He's going to be, a lot more sluggish than a wing player. But that's not how Amare Stoudemire played in real life. Amare Stoudemire was incredibly quick. He would often take people off the dribble, take them into the high post and make a quick move towards the hoop. And he was super explosive, and he was amazing at getting up and down the floor. Same with a guy like Sean Marion and whatnot. So I think that's another issue historically that video games have struggled with.
Oh, I agree on all 3 points. And that last one in particular was one that I was thinking about as well, because of that game we played in NBA Live 2004. And talking about Shaq being able to back down in 2K6 and go up and dunk over people with the shot stick reminded me that he too has been hit with that they're trying to make it so that he's not like NBA Live 2002, where he could just dunk over everybody with the press of a button, basically, that you do have to work a little bit hard to overpower defenders. But a lot of games, Shaq will get pushed around too much, get forced into an adjusted layup when he's going up for a dunk. If nothing else, contact might force him to miss a dunk sometimes, but more often than not, he was overpowering his defenders, especially when he was young and healthy. Yeah, like you said, it's hard to pick just one, because as great as basketball games are, as much as we enjoy them, as far as they've come, there are still issues, still things that they're trying to implement in games. One thing that has come to mind recently, though, and it's come to mind because I've been playing some 2K15 and we connected on it as well, is trying to represent player weaknesses. And what I mean is poor free throw shooters not making them in the hands of the CPU, shooting too well, when you leave a player open, when you give him the space to shoot, when you dare him to shoot, and he makes the shot, even though most of the time he shouldn't. And this is where developers and other gamers will say, look, it happens, and certainly it does. I mean, players make all kinds of crazy shots, but that shouldn't be the standard of, it happens every now and again, so it's okay when it happens frequently in the hands of the CPU. So the issue at hand is the CPU doing things with players that it really shouldn't do that often. Shaq being able to make free throws. You notice when I left Reggie Evans open in our game of NBA 2K25, daring him to drive, he put the ball on the floor and finished a little bit too easily. I was daring him to shoot because he couldn't shoot. So things like that, trying to represent player weaknesses in a way that doesn't make it too easy. Because yes, they should be able to surprise you, and they should be able to not just be so easily defeated, but sometimes player weaknesses aren't represented very well.
Yeah, I'd say that NBA 2K25 actually has that issue with the default roster with the current teams. So my brother and I have played a full season against those current teams, and they have big guys like power forwards and centers who either took under 10 threes the prior season or, around 15 or something like that. They never shoot them. They don't shoot them well either, even for that 10 or 15 attempts. They have them out there routinely hitting threes, right? And they shouldn't be. We should be able to leave those players because they're not comfortable out there. If you're taking 10 to 15 threes or less and you're playing 60 or more games, you are not comfortable
exactly
out there as a three-point shooter. So yeah, no, there's still problems like that with the current roster. However, I will say this. I would rather have it be that way and then players be explosive that should be explosive, big guys that are supposed to be able to take you off the dribble, big guys are supposed to be able to take you from the high post and do things well. I would take the lesser of two evils there and have more games represent those players properly.
Indeed.
So that's the way I feel. I will also say about another struggle that I think game developers have kind of fought with. Once they adopted true shooting forms, making it so players who, like you stated, Shaq, who are not good free throw shooters, making it so that their shot isn't too easy to shoot as a user, right? There are some video games, and it's mostly with that Shaq rushed free throw. You know how they always have like two different free throws for Shaq in video games? They have the one where it's really super slow and delayed, and he pushes it with one hand.
The big wind up,
Or they have, yeah, right. Or they have the Shaq free throw where it's a quick release, right? Like he has a little hitch in it. He shoots it with two hands. But that quick release form for Shaq at the foul line, most of the time, even on like Hall of Fame on NBA 2K games, I can shoot like sometimes 70, 80% with that. And that's because the shooting form itself is easy.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that games have struggled with that in the past. And then you'll have some really good free throw shooters go up to the line. And because their real life form isn't so easy to emulate in the video game, you're shooting worse with them than you are with Shaq, even though they're like an 80 to 90% free throw shooter. So I always found that interesting. I think that once they adopted true shooting forms for players in the mid 2000s, I think that added a whole new set of challenges for developers.
Oh, for sure. And trying to tie the timing into whether it's tied to the animation, whether it's simply tied to a shot meter, etc. They've gone both ways, both Live and 2K with that. And there are competing schools of thought as to which is better, different preferences. And I should say that obviously there are games where players do things out of the ordinary. There were games in Shaq's career where he did shoot well, had good nights from the foul line, but they are the anomaly. And it feels like the CPU is always able to have that on night at the foul line and to control players at their best and doing unbelievable things more often than not. And it's a way of maintaining the challenge, obviously, so you kind of need it, but it also feels very false when you care about sim, when you care about realism, and you're trying to use that real strategy and say, well, I want to force this player left, or I want to leave this player wide open, give them space because they're not strong shooters, they're going to miss more often than not, and they make you pay. And here's the thing, Josh Smith should not make you pay with his outside shooting. He will hit some, obviously, especially wide open, but give him a little bit of room, force him to shoot. That was an effective strategy the defenders used against him. So that's something that doesn't always translate to the virtual hardwood.
I feel like Josh Smith, that was more of a strategy that could be utilized with him in like the early 2010s.
Sure.
Yeah, I've been watching some full games and whatnot, and Josh Smith did hit contested shots pretty routinely. I'm not saying he was a great outside shooter, but he definitely, as a young player, could hit that J, and teams had to respect him, especially in the mid-range. I'll say that once he started losing a little bit of his athleticism, he started depending on that outside shot way too much, and he would take some bad ones more often than not, and he would shoot pretty poor, and teams wanted him to shoot that, right? They're like, shoot that shot.
Oh, yeah.
Please.
I mean, he might not be the best example, admittedly, but you know what I mean? Like that player that you can leave open and dare to shoot, basically.
Right, exactly. And there's been countless players like that in history, and that's hard to represent in video games. I will say, though, that when the game gets it right, it's a beautiful thing. So we're playing against the Supersonics in that NBA 2K25 game that we talked about earlier on the show. We're coming down to the end of the game, and I intentionally fouled Reggie Evans twice on strips. I was just feverishly hitting the steal button because we were trying to, we were trying to come back at that point. They went up, and I think he missed all 4 free throws, right? That's accurate. Reggie Evans is a terrible free throw shooter.
Absolutely. Oh,
right?
It's great when it happens, yeah.
Right. When it happens and it's realistic and your strategy paid off like it would in real life, there you go, right? Like, that's awesome. So I think it's hard to balance, and I think that a lot of games have done a good job of creating a balance that makes sense. But, yeah, no, I definitely see where you're coming from there.
And another one, just really quickly, it's something that has gotten better over the years, but and probably more an issue in the games that we were playing growing up, but more fouls on the perimeter than in the paint, more reach-in fouls than fouls at the rim. Some games have struggled getting that ratio right. It feels like more guards foul out or get into foul trouble from steal attempts, and some of that is on the user, of course, spamming the steal button and trying to poke the ball away when it's not a good opportunity. But some games, especially early on, it felt like the players always getting in foul trouble with guards rather than the bigs, as it was in real life, especially back in the day when there was more physicality in the paint and shot blockers roaming the lane.
Sometimes it's one or the other in a game. Like, it will be really dominant foul-wise on the perimeter, or it will be really dominant in the paint. For example, I would say that NBA 2K14 for Xbox One and for PC, when you drive the lane, when you get into the paint area, that's when most of the fouls happen, right? I think NBA 2K14 has a pretty realistic foul balance, but more often than not, you're getting those fouls on the drive, like as you're entering the paint, or like with a big man. in the paint. And then there's other games where there's not enough fouls in the paint and most of them are coming on the perimeter. So I think that's also a tough balance to find.
Definitely, and it does come down to the way we play the game. Again, people spamming that steal button more easily than blocking the shot that's coming later in the shot clock. Actually, 2K15 has got a pretty good ratio as well, I've found.
Yeah, NBA 2K15 is just so similar to 2K14. That's why you're having fun with it, right? Because you like 2K14 and the gameplay is so similar. So let's get to the couple community responses that we received. Mike Harshman at MKHarsh33 states the bumping physics. And I mentioned that at the onset of this segment. It's hard to find the balance between, do we want brick wall defense? Do we want more blow-bys? Where do you find that happy medium? And like I stated earlier, I think that the happy medium was 2K16. I think that 2K16 had really sound defense. I think a good mixture of bumping and blow-bys when they were appropriate. And I think that the AI just in general on defense is really strong in that game. I also think games like NBA 2K11 got it right. I think that NBA 2K11 has a really good balance of, side-by-sides and when you should be bumped and pick up the ball, etc. So, yeah, the bumping, the side-by-sides. Defense must be tough to program.
And there's a great example that we recently played, NBA Live 2004. They brought in the 10-man freestyle, the new 2-man animations, more physicality, didn't have the tin cans bumping as in 2003. You had players meshing together and jockeying for position and so forth, but at the same time, they would get stuck together. The collision still needed work. It was too easy to just keep bumping the ball handler back and back. That was a big defensive strategy, just keep bumping the ball handler, getting them out of position. And even 2005 and 06, there was still some of it there, still working out physics at that time with basketball video games, but they were an improvement on 2004.
No, I definitely agree. I also want to point out that the next community response speaks to both NBA Live 2004 and a game like NBA Live 19. Avery on our Discord stated, some games feeling robotic due to an excessive amount of animations. I think that NBA Live 2004 was way over animated, right? Constantly being made to pick up your ball and being put into that situation where if you don't pass it within like 2 seconds, you're going to, bring the ball to the floor and then it's going to roll and defense is going to grab it, right?
Turnover,
and then and then the excessive amount of animations at the hoop when you drive and those canned blocks, which happen way too often. And then you have NBA Live 19, which I find very robotic feeling as a video game. I feel like every single drive, you're just given these random animations. And oftentimes players making impossible shots constantly as a result, no matter what difficulty that you're playing on. You don't really have control. The game is just giving you all of these animations. He talks about robotic. One of my biggest problems with Live 19 and a bit with 18 is the robotic passing. The players not moving fluent on their passes, the players being delayed on their passes as a result, and the same with the catching animations, right? So I think one of NBA Live 19's biggest flaws was the fact that it did feel robotic and that most every single drive to the hoop felt like it was canned and you were just given a bunch of animations.
Yeah, when the game feels heavy and canned and predetermined, it does take away from the experience, absolutely. And you do get those awkward animations, those awkward transitional animations as the game tries to make something work. Live 07 is obviously the king of horrible transitional animations and warping and so forth. But Live 18, and certainly 19, as much as I like 18, does have that issue as well, where you do get stuck in those animations. When you go for a block, you know it's going to happen, and you're kind of like, that's a bit disappointing.
Yeah, it's just unnatural, right? Like You're being forced into blocks in NBA Live 19 and in NBA Live 2004 that you didn't deserve. That's the way I feel about it. Like, you're jumping way ahead of time. You're jumping when you probably shouldn't be jumping, and you're being transferred over to the offensive player to get a block, like a canned block, right? Like, I don't know. And there's some 2Ks recently that were kind of like that, especially with those snatch blocks.
But it's also difficult, I imagine, because you're trying to make it look good, and sometimes when you do let those transitional animations try to be more natural, you look at 2K15, as much as I'm enjoying it, I've sent you some clips of Terry Hansen making adjusted layups, and they look pretty good, but there's a little bit of awkwardness there because it is transitioning out of one animation into another. If it was canned, it would look better, but it would feel worse. So there is that aesthetics versus functionality, I suppose.
Same with 2K25, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there was a couple layups I made in that game where I took it to the basket and the animation started playing out 10 feet before I got to the rim. And it ends up being this layup that was no matter what going to go in and no matter what not going to get blocked. And it's an animation we have seen so many different times before. And the defense is also canned in those situations where, like I said, they can't get the block. It won't happen no matter what. That's got to be tough to program. I will say that NBA Live 15 and NBA Live 16 are often much more enjoyable for me to go back and play than games like Live 18 and Live 19 because they lacked a lot of those canned sequences. Blocks in those games, you felt like you earned them. They didn't feel like they were canned. Same with steals in that game. You made a move and you felt like, you know what, I had control over that move and I had control over that finish. And while I think those games are definitely rough in many ways and sometimes animations are delayed and input is delayed and there's too much momentum in the movement when you're trying to like come to a full stop, I have more enjoyment playing those games than the newer lives because of the reasons I just stated. Same thing with a game like NBA 2K14 and a game like 2K15 and 2K16 and even 2K17, actually all of those 2Ks, I felt like defense didn't feel canned, right? You get a block, you feel good about it. You get a steal, you feel good about it. You beat somebody to a spot, they're not just going to always push through it like using a canned animation or like using a dominant badge, etc. So I felt like defense and offense from 14 through 2K17 really felt overall organic, and that's why I enjoy those titles.
Well, 2K14 and 2K17, PlayStation 4, Xbox One generation, and of course PC with 2K17, some of my favourite steal mechanics in the history of basketball gaming. And yeah, it's because of that lack of a canned feel. And you look at things like body steals, leg steals, elbow blocks, things like that. That's also going to be very tough to clean that up. They have been able to clean that up a little bit over the years. Got to be easier said than done, obviously. But again, that does come down to a more organic feel. So I do appreciate that at the same time when it looks good.
Yeah. I also think, before we end the segment, I think that slider tweaks and appropriate roster editing to make these players, play like they do in real life and whatnot, I think that stuff does go a long way. For example, this session that we had on NBA 2K25 with that edited roster, with those edited sliders, felt 10 times better, and the session was 10 times more fun than the last session that we tried using that same Kobe era roster. And we were using just the default no edits Kobe era roster. So for our listeners, I understand that the players in these games and the teams and whatnot should be represented realistically and given the appropriate attention to detail by default, and that you shouldn't have to go in and spend countless hours to edit these players and teams. And I also understand that you shouldn't have to go in and mess with sliders constantly in order to give yourself a fun experience. But I recommend dabbling in it if you're not having a good time, because it can make a difference.
As somebody who remembers games before roster editing, before sliders, they are definitely essential. But thank you to everybody who responded to our community questions this week. And as far as things that games still haven't gotten right, hey, that's a topic that we can circle back to quite often, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, we're never going to run out of topics for this show. I'd also like us to have a few guests on, because it's always fun having people join the show and the audience to be able to listen to different perspectives and whatnot. So, yeah, it'll be a good 2025.
Absolutely. We'll see what we can tee up. In the meantime, though, that has brought us to the end of this week's show. As always, thank you for tuning in, and please join us again next week and every week on the NLSC, m-live.com, our YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to podcasts. In the meantime, make sure you're following us on social media That's where you can get in touch with us, and of course, stay up to date with all of our content. So Derek, go ahead and plug the handles.
You can reach me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at D43G and at D4384. I'm also on the NLSC, D43, and on YouTube, D43.
As for me, I'm Andrew in the forum and Andrew NLSC on X. The NLSC is on X and Facebook at the NLSC. We're also NLC Basketball on Instagram and Threads. We're on YouTube at NBA Live Series Center. And of course, keep a look to the NLSC itself, nba-live.com, for everything we do for basketball video games. So, thank you once again for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Derek.
Go get buckets, everyone.